Hey guys, it's Hank from Sprues and Brews, and today I'm back with another scale modeling tutorial. Specifically, we're going to be looking at 135 scale armor camouflage that would have been used by British and Commonwealth forces during World War II. If you look at reference photos from the 40s, you see a lot of Commonwealth vehicles were covered with tarps, netting, and something called Hessian tape, which was a burlap type material that they would drape over the barrels and around the turret of the tank to kind of disguise its shape. I get a lot of questions on Instagram about how I replicate this type of camouflage, so I figured today would be a good opportunity to walk you through my process. So an example of what I'm talking about is this guy right here. This is my 135 scale Sherman Firefly IC, and this has nets, it has Hessian tape, and it has tarp camouflage on it. So we're gonna try and replicate something similar to this. The example we'll be using today is a 135 scale Churchill tank. This Churchill tank. I finished this a few years ago and I figured it would be a good base for me to practice these techniques and kind of show you what I do. Really important to note here, if you're doing this at home on your own build, this one is already painted, I'm gonna paint it again. But if you're gonna replicate these steps, do this right after you finish building. Don't do it after you paint. In the next video, I'm gonna completely repaint this and we're gonna start from the ground up. So don't pay attention to the colors here right now because we're gonna start from scratch. As I mentioned, this is gonna be a two-part video. So this one is gonna be the actual build process for how I make these three camouflage elements, and then we'll have a separate video for the painting process. If you're only interested in replicating one of these camouflage types, I'll put timestamps in the video so you can jump to whatever feature you wanna try out. All right, and with that, let's get into it. All right, as I mentioned in the intro, this is the 135 scale Churchill tank that we'll be using as a test bed for camouflage techniques today. Just to reiterate, I'm doing this as a refurb project, so if you're doing this on a new build, make sure you do these techniques right after you finish the build and before you actually paint the vehicle. Okay, so here I'm using 135 scale purpose-built hobby camouflage netting, but if you have gauze or cheesecloth around the house, that'll work fine for this too. So here we're going to fit the turret of the vehicle for the actual camouflage netting, just to try and get an idea of how it's going to look once it's actually on there. Now we can cut the net to the shape that we want. Don't worry about being too specific here because the next step is going to get a little messy. Okay, for the glue mixture, we're going to use a leftover takeout container and some Elmer's glue. Any white PVA glue will work fine for this. Add a dollop to the takeout container, about the size of a quarter. A little bit bigger is okay though. Okay, next add a little bit of tap water to the glue. Using anything you've got handy, stir the mixture to combine the two parts. Once that's done, we're going to soak our pre-cut net in the mixture. Try to soak the net as much as possible so it adheres well to the surface of the tank. The net might want to fold in on itself after it gets soaked in the glue, so try and be patient with it. Once you get the net flattened out, drape it over any part of the tank that you want to start with. You'll probably have to fight with it a little bit like I am here, but just stick with it until you find something that looks good to you. Alright, it looks like we've got that section pretty well covered. You can always use scissors to cut off any excess that you don't like. The nice thing about using PVA glue here is that it's safe for your hands and you can make adjustments as you go. Once you get that first piece of netting in place, move on to the other sections of the tank using the same process. It's a good idea to find a reference photo online that you want to try and replicate. For this particular vehicle, I'm putting netting on both the turret and the sides of the hull. All right, and with all the netting in place, we can move on to the next step in the process. Okay, moving on to tarps. So when I do this part of the process, I like to use some resin accessories that I get from Value Gear. These have really great detail and they look awesome all over the side of a vehicle. For the tarps themselves, we're going to use tissue paper that you'd use to package a gift. It doesn't matter what color it is. Me, I'm using this neon yellow, but it doesn't really matter because we're going to paint over it all at the end anyway. Using the exact same process we did with the nets, you're going to dip the tarp in the PVA glue mixture, and then you're going to gently drape it on the tank where you want the tarp to be. I like to do a few layers of these tarps. It's all about adding up the texture on the tank. When you look at historical reference photos of these vehicles, they were always loaded down with packs and bags and tarps, and there weren't really any straight, clean lines. So we're just going to break up any areas that you think were flat and crew members would have thrown stuff to get from point A to point B. Also important to note here, the PVA glue mixture isn't strong enough to hold these resin parts in place. What I'm doing is fitting them to create a recess in the tarps themselves, so once they dry, it'll provide a nice area for them to slip back into after they've been painted and weathered separately. There's really no rhyme or reason here. I just kind of go with the flow and add tarps wherever I think they look good. If you put one on and you don't really like the placement, you can pull it off. The glue is going to dry clear anyway, and we're going to paint over the whole thing at the end, so it doesn't really matter. I'm adding one last long strip of tarp here, and I think it's important to note when I do this, I try and let the tarps overlap each other a little bit. It kind of creates an illusion that they might be one piece, and it gives you some options when you're doing the painting to use different colors and tones to kind of pull out variation between them. So just a good idea when you're giving this a try. And that's it for tarps. Moving on to the final step. Now we're going to do the most interesting part, in my opinion. This is the Hessian tape. So here I'm using Tamiya's masking tape, but you can really use any masking tape you have lying around the house. Now we're going to cut some long, thin strips in the tape. Try and vary how wide they are between each one. Some can be a little thicker, some can be a little thinner. You'll see what I mean as we get to the next step. Next, we're going to cut across those thin strips that we just made. Again, do this at different lengths. Some are going to be a little longer, some are going to be a little shorter. The name of the game is to create variation between them. Take any one of those individual strips you just cut and drape it over the barrel, as you see me doing here. The goal is to just have the back sides touch a little bit. You can see in the close-up there, as I did, just so it looks like they're naturally hanging with weight off of the barrel. We're going to repeat that process a bunch of times until it starts to look convincing. The trick here is to not make things look too uniform. They want to look a little lackadaisical and all over the place as they drape over the barrel. Again, this is camouflage. It's going to be free-flowing as the tank's moving around in the landscape. So just drape them on there so they look like they have weight and they have a little bit of flow in the wind. Here's my Churchill about halfway through. You can see it's starting to look pretty convincing now. Keep adding strips in this haphazard crisscross manner until you're happy with the result. Again, it's up to personal preference, so whenever you think it's time to stop, you can go for it. And just like that, we've got all of our new camo elements applied to our 135 scale tank. Look out for part 2 in this video series when we're going to go back and learn how to paint everything we just did. Until then, cheers!